When it comes to the New Orleans Saints 2024 opponents, the Denver Broncos are the clear option when it comes to kicking off the season. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I'm your host, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a senior writer and reporter on Saints News Network. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the schedule set to be released later on today. So we're taking a look at three of the biggest questions facing the Saints this offseason. We're going to dive into the divisional opponents. Who is the most improved in the NFC South away from the New Orleans Saints? We're going to dive into their toughest matchups. Who are the most challenging opponents that the Saints will take on in 2024? And we're going to lead all of this off with, well, the first game of the year. Who should be the New Orleans Saints' first opponent? Well, that feels obvious. The Denver Broncos and head coach Sean Payton. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here and making us your first listen of the day every day, and for being an everydayer here on the Locked On Saints podcast, proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use the promo code Locked On NFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. The Denver Broncos and Sean Payton coming to town to the Big Easy, the big return for Sean Payton, should be the Saints' leadoff game for the 2024 NFL season. If the NFL can't figure that out, it's a big old mystery to me how they couldn't figure it out. They already announced that the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens will be the big kickoff game. We got a Browns game leading off Tom Brady's first ever time as a broadcaster on Fox, all this other stuff. First game as a broadcaster on Fox, all that kind of stuff. This is something that the NFL just simply has to get right. And look, I know Saints fans are over and done when it comes to Sean Payton. A lot of folks have mentioned they don't want to hear about Sean Payton anymore. They don't care about Sean Payton anymore, anything like that. I 100% get that. I get it. I understand. But this opportunity for the Saints organization to get a win over the former head coach that surprisingly stepped away from the game for a year. There were rumors that maybe he might want to come back to New Orleans, all these other things. Ultimately, he ends up back in Denver. I don't think that the Saints were interested in firing a guy to move to kind of rehash that whole thing and try to rekindle that old flame with Sean Payton, whatever it might be. This is one of the most important games for the New Orleans Saints 2024 season, even though it's an AFC opponent, which means that it doesn't really factor into their playoff health when it comes to tiebreakers and things like that. It doesn't have that deep of a playoff implication, but it's got win-loss record implication. It's got emotional charge, which is what I think gives this game a lot of gravitas, maybe the right word, because of how emotionally charged this game will be. And the Saints coming out week one and potentially getting a win against their former head coach who left. That's not a bad situation. That's not a bad kick in the pants. I was trying to choose my words carefully there in case you're in the car with the kids. But it's a pretty good kick in the pants to start off your season to get a win over Sean Payton. So I think that the 9-8 Denver Broncos traveling to take on the 9-8 New Orleans Saints should be the game that kicks off the New Orleans Saints 2024 NFL, or excuse me, the 8-9 Denver Broncos traveling to take on the 9-8 New Orleans Saints should be the game that kicks off the season for the Saints. It's interesting too, because it immediately puts the Saints up to the test, I assume, when it comes to the rookie quarterback question and the mobile quarterback question. They've done very well against rookie quarterbacks here as of late. Knocking on wood there. But the mobile quarterback question is one that the Saints set out to solve this offseason. They brought in a guy like Willie Gay who can help them there. They brought in a guy like Chase Young who could potentially help them there. Carl Granderson has gotten better in that area. They drafted Isaiah Foskey last year in the second round, and one of the big evaluations of him was his ability and his athleticism and his speed and all the things that he would be able to do to help mitigate the mobile quarterback problem that the New Orleans Saints have had. So did they get it done? You'd immediately get a measure on that barometer. So I think the Denver Broncos should be the first game for the New Orleans Saints. But there are two other games that I think are of utmost importance for the New Orleans Saints this year. The 10-7 Los Angeles Rams, that game, I think, is very important. It is absolutely a playoff implication game because you're competing within the NFC. These two teams continuously finish close to one another in playoff seeding. Oftentimes one is waiting to see what the other is going to do in order to maybe get into the playoffs, things like that. So they will have the Los Angeles Rams at home. They'll play away against the Los Angeles Chargers, but they'll be at home against the Los Angeles Rams. I think that's going to be a very important game for New Orleans. Another emotionally charged game should be the game at home against the Las Vegas Raiders. Not as important in terms of its impact for the team, but its impact and kind of emotional charge for Derek Carr should be taken into account. We certainly elevated the importance of Jameis Winston's first game as the starting quarterback against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Unfortunately, that game did not end the way that anybody wanted it to while Jameis Winston and the Saints were looking good. But you're hoping for a different outcome here for the New Orleans Saints and Derek Carr going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. And let's be real, the last time the Las Vegas Raiders came to town to take on the New Orleans Saints was with Derek Carr at the helm at quarterback. That went very well for the New Orleans Saints as they pitched a shutout. The last game that I want to highlight is one of the biggest or most important games for the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't have a lot of faith in the Philadelphia Eagles to repeat as a playoff team in 2024. Hot take, maybe. But there's always those teams that regress, fall out of the playoffs a year after they made the playoffs, all those other things. And just the way that the Philadelphia Eagles ended the season last year was massive. Now you've got new coordinators. You got some big changes on the team as well. The Philadelphia Eagles finished 11-6 last year, including dropping several games straight at the end of the year. But I do think that this is going to be an important game for the New Orleans Saints as well. Just like the game against the Los Angeles Rams, this is another home game. This is another team that sometimes seeding will either depend upon or you're battling, jostling for seeding in the NFC playoff race with this team. If the New Orleans Saints want to get to the playoffs, they have to win games against the Los Angeles Rams. They have to win games against the Philadelphia Eagles, these NFC opponents that hover around where they are. Another team that's going to have an impact much like that will be the Green Bay Packers as well. Maybe the New York Giants on a little road trip out to the Big Apple. I don't put the New York Giants in the same class of team that I put the Los Angeles Rams and the Philadelphia Eagles, but that one might have some impact on seeding as well. But for me, Los Angeles Rams, Philadelphia Eagles games of utmost importance. They prove everything in terms of your new offense going up against defenses that are familiar with the brand of the wide zone offense because they practice against it every day. And then, of course, it's a big time positioning challenge for your defense. And then Dennis Allen versus Sean Payton. The New Orleans Saints versus the Denver Sean Paytons. The New Orleans Saints defense versus a mobile quarterback. I assume it'll be Bo Nix starting. It's very interesting. I think Denver should start off the season, but I also think that Los Angeles Rams and that Philadelphia Eagles game, those two games in particular, very, very, very important. Starting off the season against the Las Vegas Raiders has a storyline there too. So the NFL could go that way, but man, the former head coach angle, just too good. Too good to pass up. Too good to pass up. As long as the Denver Broncos aren't wearing white shoes, should be all good. No white cleats. All right. Coming up next, let's take a look at the teams that are the toughest opponents. Yeah, I mentioned Los Angeles Rams. Yeah, I mentioned the Philadelphia Eagles. But like I mentioned, I don't have a lot of faith in the Philadelphia Eagles going into 2024. But there are three teams that I think the New Orleans Saints will have the toughest time to beat, including, of course, the former Super Bowl champions. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, our official sports betting partners here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's winner take all time in the NBA and in the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win on your own. as well. So you can bet on everything going on around the MLB and the NHL playoffs. You can bet on the individual games, who's going to win it all, who's going to win a series, over-unders on players in terms of goals scored, points scored, all that good stuff. And right now, new customers are going to get $150 in bonus bets if their first $5 bet is a winning $5 bet. That's $150 that you can then bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and much more. They just mentioned Kansas City, Baltimore opening up the season. Kansas City favored by 2.5 on the road. You can already bet on that if you want to, and you can use some of those bonus bets if you're a first-time customer and win with that $5 bet. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to make every playoff shot count, make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, family, the New Orleans Saints have some tough opponents coming up in 2024, even though folks will tell you that they have the easiest schedule in the NFL. They still have some very, very tough opponents. So who are the toughest opponents for the New Orleans Saints? Well, we got to lead off with the back-to-back Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to also go and check out that Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel, giving you everything you need to know around the world of sports from the local experts that know each team the best, that cover them every single day, just like we do for the New Orleans Saints here on Locked On Saints. Make sure you go and check that out. You can find Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So who are the toughest opponents for the New Orleans Saints in 2024? Well, we got to start with Kansas City. I said former Super Bowl champions. To be fair, all three of the teams I'm about to mention are former Super Bowl champions, but more to the point, the Kansas City Chiefs are the back-to-back Super Bowl champions. Now, I think it's going to be really interesting is when this game is scheduled, okay? Is this game scheduled towards the end of the season? Is this game scheduled early on in the season? That's going to have a big impact, having to go to Arrowhead and play in that outdoor setting. There's always, look, people might not want to hear about it, but I got to tell you, there's always a Taylor Swift factor. They get hype over at Arrowhead Stadium when Taylor Swift is present. One of the best things that could potentially happen to the New Orleans Saints is actually that they're traveling to take on the Kansas City Chiefs while Taylor Swift is playing here in New Orleans. That way they don't have to worry about that. No distractions, right? Taylor Swift is here in New Orleans. The Saints are over there in Kansas City. They're not getting hyped the way that they would get with Taylor in the building. That's probably a good thing. But the Kansas City Chiefs, 11-6 last season. So a little bit of vulnerability there, but typically the games the Kansas City Chiefs drop are games within their division, those tricky games within the division. But obviously, they lost to the Detroit Lions early on in the 2023 season. So really, if you look, after that, they went off and rattled off a bunch more wins and stuff like that. So this is still a remarkably good team. And they are maintaining a lot of their team. The good news for the New Orleans Saints is that even though this is a tough opponent, one of the most challenging opponents that they'll face in 2024, it is an opponent that it's an AFC opponent, so the impact is light, right? The impact is really only based on either A, common opponents, or B, when it comes down to your initial win-loss record. So you can afford to drop a game to an AFC opponent at some point during the season and then still take advantage of your tiebreakers and things like that, still be in good position if you're winning your in-conference opponent games, and more importantly, your divisional games, which we will get to divisional opponents here a little bit later, because there is a team within the division that will be a tough matchup for New Orleans, or could be a tough matchup. On paper, they're a tough matchup, but we'll see if they can really actually put it all together. So obviously, look, going up against Patrick Mahomes, going up against Travis Kelce, going up against Spags defense, like the Steve Spagnuolo defense, their defensive coordinator over there. There's a lot of challenging things about going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. Although when the Saints did play against Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs years ago, they held their own to an extent. Now, Kansas City still won that game. They still put a lot of points on the board, all those other things, but they hung in that game, and they kind of created the blueprint for how teams played Kansas City throughout the rest of that season, sticking with the too high, making them run the football, challenging them to run the football, all those other things. Unfortunately, the run defense didn't necessarily hold up very well in that game. And Patrick Mahomes was still Patrick Mahomes and still made some Mahomesian moments in that game. But it forced them the Saints forced Kansas City to get those Mahomesian moments and not just walk in and walk out with an easy dub. You know what I mean? So I give the Saints Saints defense and Dennis Allen a little bit of credit for how they held up to that years ago. Let's see how they hold up to it here in 2024. And maybe the Saints having a wide zone offense that they're now practicing against, that they're scheming up, that they have a more in-depth knowledge of, which they already had good knowledge of it. Dennis Allen's coached against it a ton, but maybe there's something about practicing against it every day that maybe helps out now that you get to some of these opponents that run these similar wide zone systems, like Kansas City, like the Los Angeles Rams, like the Philadelphia Eagles, so on and so, and the Los Angeles Chargers, who they'll travel to take on, so on and so forth. Another tough opponent, in my opinion, will be the Green Bay Packers. 9-8 last season. A pretty surprising playoff team, a pretty surprising team, and a pretty surprising team for how young it was, with Jordan Love and Christian Watkins and Romeo Doubs and all these other pieces that they had there, and their young defense. The Saints dropped a heartbreaker against them last year, blowing, what was it, a 17-point lead at one point. That's a tough one. And look, that was Derek Carr. It was the first time that Derek Carr got injured, all those other things. So there was some context to that, but I got to tell you, it's still a tough place to play. Lambeau, even in a noon game. And look, the Saints haven't been their best traveling to Lambeau either. And now this is another one that you look at, much like Arrowhead Stadium with the Kansas City Chiefs, and go, when is this game going to be scheduled? The earlier in the season you feel, the better. And look, by the time that this airs, there might be some leaks that already come out. We might already have the answers to this question. But nonetheless, paying attention to when this game is scheduled, just like the Arrowhead game, there is the weather factor of it all as well. So it'll be interesting, or not interesting, but that's a big thing that you're looking at that's going to be massively consequential in terms of how this game ends up rolling out. Now, do I think that the Saints could go somewhere and win an outdoor game? Yeah. And look, they're playing a few outdoor games this season and everything like that, but not an exorbitant amount, right? They've got one in Carolina. They got one in Tampa. Those are the ones that they play every year. They have the Kansas City outdoor game, and then they have the New York outdoor game, and they have the Green Bay Packers outdoor game. Everything else is indoors. Everything else is indoors. I know Los Angeles technically is considered like an indoor-outdoor type of situation because they have like a little sliver of it that's open and it's a glass ceiling. It's an indoor stadium, okay? For all intents and purposes for how it impacts the players, it's an indoor stadium. But other than that, they're Atlanta, Dallas, and then that game against Los Angeles. So it's really only 5 games they play outdoors. So you just want to make sure that they're at good times of the year. Like having Los Angeles close to Christmas last year. Yeah, it was Thursday night game before Christmas last year. That was awesome because that wasn't Green Bay. That wasn't Cleveland like we saw a few years ago. Now, we did watch New Orleans win that Cleveland game. But anyway, I think that's another one that you're looking at for the when is it played. And then finally, the Dallas Cowboys. I think the Saints just play the Dallas Cowboys tough, like play them well. But sometimes don't get that little bit of separation that they need. 12-5 Dallas Cowboys coming off. I'm always pretty low on the Cowboys going into every year. Maybe it's just because I'm not a Cowboys fan. And so it feels like you're either a Cowboys fan or you don't respect the Cowboys, like it's one or the other. And I definitely fall under the non-fan portion when it comes to the Dallas Cowboys. But I just think that there's so many question marks to that team right now, and kind of like where, having to kind of fall back on Ezekiel Elliott after they didn't get I assume they were going after Jonathan Brooks, the running back out of Texas. Tony Pollard ends up going elsewhere, all this other stuff. Now they still have, talented receivers and things like that, but it's not necessarily the same team, but it is still Micah Parsons. And Micah Parsons will make any team's life a living heck, I'll say. So I think that's still going to be a tough game for them, playing in Dallas too. Like that's a strong fan base that will show up for its home team, all that stuff. The best case scenario for New Orleans is that they play that game late in the season, and that that Dallas is struggling, and maybe they get, maybe you get some secondary market tickets to help kind of lean the dome a little, or lean AT&T Stadium a little bit more black and gold, right? Not more than blue and white, but still just a little bit more black and gold than it would be if they travel to take on the Dallas Cowboys early on in the season where there's still hope, or it's a 13-0 team. You know what I mean? So those to me are the 3 toughest opponents that the Saints will face in 2024. Coming up next, let's take a look at the division and see if we can identify who the most improved team is in the division, at least on paper. Can they pull it off will be a different question. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at Game Time, my favorite place to go, especially for last-minute tickets, because it's the best place to go for last-minute tickets. Whether you're looking at the NFL, the NBA, live theater, music, concerts, dance, like whatever it is that you're looking for, you can find it over at Game Time today. And we're talking about all these high-profile games for the New Orleans Saints. Denver Broncos coming to town with Sean Payton as their head coach. The Las Vegas Raiders traveling to take on the Derek Carr-led New Orleans Saints, and a little bit of an emotional game there. A lot of Las Vegas Raiders fans are still Derek Carr fans. There's an opportunity for you to still see your favorite team and Derek Carr here in New Orleans. This is the place to go to grab your tickets. Whether you're planning months in advance or moments in advance, you're going to be able to get flash deals. You're going to be able to see all-in pricing, knowing that there's no surprises there. Basically, you're going to be able to take all of the guesswork out of buying tickets by simply heading over to Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use that promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Is it the Atlanta Falcons? They're the most improved team outside of New Orleans in the NFC South division. It sure looks that way on paper. We got all that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Don't forget, we are your team every day. Come back tomorrow for our breakdown of the actual schedule, which will be released later on today. It'll leak all throughout the day, and then the NFL is going to pop up with their little schedule special at 7 p.m. and go, look at all this information you already knew. It's going to be cool. Awesome. Great job, NFL. It's my least favorite thing that the NFL does. I'm just going to be honest, is the schedule release thing. I love that the schedule comes out, but just release it. Like, it gets leaked all throughout the day, and then they do all this pomp and circumstance at 7 p.m. that nobody watches because they already know their favorite team's schedule through, social media or podcast or like whatever. Like, it's a weird thing that the NFL just insists on doing, but hey, whatever. Okay, so let's take a look at the division here, because for the New Orleans Saints, I made the argument the other day that the Saints haven't really improved their roster, not their team, because I think their team has improved because of the changes they made on the coaching staff. But I think their roster, they mostly maintained their talent and filled holes. That's what it feels like that they really did. There's not a ton of places that I look at and go, okay, well, this team is better right now than it was last year. Linebacker feels that way with the addition of Willie Gay. Defensive line could get to that place with Chase Young having been added. We'll see what happens with the rookies, but I consider the rookies all unknowns. On the offensive line, you don't know who your left guard starter is right now. It's tough to say that Taliesin Fuang is going to be an improvement over Ryan Ramczyk, who Ryan Ramczyk was last year. We have to wait and see on the rookies, is what I'm trying to get at. It's not that I don't believe in the rookies. It's just that, we don't know. There's a lot of expectation to put on a guy that's never taken an NFL snap before, so let's wait and figure it out, because it might also be a changing perspective over the course of the season, right? Running back might inherently get a little bit better because you're getting Kendre Miller, hopefully healthier now going into his second year, those other spots. And I think your depth at places got better, right? Wide receiver, your depth got much better, all that. But your top end talent, for the most part, kind of just remained the same, which isn't a bad thing. That's not to say that the team got worse, quite the opposite. They just didn't necessarily skyrocket in terms of their improvement. But they maintain their talent, and they still have, I think, what they believe to be a good team. Now, will they be a good team on the field? They have to go out there and prove that. But much to that same conversation, I think the Atlanta Falcons are getting a ton of hype right now. They added Kirk Cousins. They, retained, some of these young pieces and all that. Now, they went out there and they also drafted Michael Penix Jr. at 8th overall, which was like the weirdest, most perplexing decision that you could make as an NFL organization right after signing a $140 million, $150 million quarterback, however much he was paid, $150+ million quarterback. bold choice, Cotton. Let's see if it works out for him. But I think that what I would say about Atlanta is that they're probably the team that's improved the most on paper. Carolina can't be in that conversation. They traded away the division's best player in Brian Burns. Tampa's remained mostly the same. They did add talent in the draft, but again, the draft is unknown players. Unknown. But then they maintain their guys. They got Mike Evans locked down. They just gave a big extension to Antoine Winfield Jr., the star safety that they have over there. They kept Baker Mayfield in town, all those other pieces. So I feel like the only team that actually made like wholesale changes was Atlanta. They got a new head coach, got a new offensive coordinator, got a new defensive coordinator, got a new quarterback. That's the quadfecta, if you will. Trifecta, quadfecta. Those are big changes. So there's two ways you can go to that. You can look at it and say, okay, do they improve in 2024 because they improve those spots? Or do they have a little bit of trouble adjusting in 2024 because all of those pieces are new? You could argue me either way. It's a wait and see thing as far as I'm concerned. But I think on paper, people will talk about the Atlanta Falcons as the most improved team in the NFC South. Atlanta finished last year 7-10, Tampa 9-8, winning the division. The New Orleans Saints also finished 9-8, but unfortunately were lost that tiebreaker. And then 2-15 were the Carolina Panthers. So Carolina, I would put still like they're still figuring it out, right? Like they just brought in Dave Canales. They have their new head coach. They put him on a 6-year contract. Everything about that situation screams no expectations for 2024. And that's good. That's an okay thing, and then you also traded away your best player for nothing. That's the other part that kind of drives me nuts. Is like they also had the opportunity to trade Brian Burns to the Los Angeles Rams for 2 first-round picks. Instead, they trade him to the New York Giants for a second and a fifth. 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth. It's just hard to say that Carolina's really taken any steps forward. You know what I mean? Tampa, a little bit of a wild card. I mentioned all that they've retained. I think the biggest thing is like how do their young players improve going into 2024? Does, Joe Tryon-Shoyinka end up having like a bigger impact in 2025 or 2024? Does Vita Vea continue to take big time steps forward? What does the offensive line look like and how does it hold up after losing some pieces there? Things like that. Like those are the things that I think that you're looking at and you're going, okay, so those are things that could hold back Tampa a little bit. The things that could hold back Atlanta are the same things that could make them a better team. New scheme, new head coach, therefore also, and then who brings in his own defense. And then you have an offensive coordinator that joins him from the Los Angeles Rams, new system, right? Kind of doing some similar things to what the New Orleans Saints did in 2023 and 2024, except they're doing it all at the same time, right? They got the new quarterback and the new offensive coordinator and the new head coach and the new coaching staff and the new pieces. Like they just kind of crammed it all into one season while the Saints took 2 seasons to do it. And I think some of that was confusion. I think some of that was the Saints expecting that it was the roster that needed to turn over, not the coaching staff. And they turned over the roster and they went, oh no, we should have turned over the coaching staff, the offensive coaching staff. And now they're turning over the offensive coaching staff and then trying to maintain as much of the roster as possible. Atlanta just said, screw it, we'll do it all at one time and everything. And so the same things that can make them better in 2024 are the things that can hold them back in 2024. I can't predict one way or another. That's just there's no sense in doing that, right? But the fact of the matter is that they improved on paper, right? Kirk Cousins, I've never been a Kirk Cousins truther. I've never been a Kirk Cousins believer and all that. I've always thought he was kind of like a middle of the road quarterback, and there were just a lot of other quarterbacks that were just like him, basically. But is that better than Desmond Ridder was last year and Taylor Heineke were last year? Yeah, that's better. But coming off the Achilles injury, got the rookie quarterback breathing down, breathing over your shoulder, watching over your shoulder, all that. Now the expectation with Michael Penix is that he's not going to do, diddly poo until 2005, 2006, or 2006, not 2005, after 2005 season, going into 2006. That might be the year they end up going to that. Outside of that, it's diddly poo. So we'll see where it goes. But I think Atlanta is the most improved on paper outside of New Orleans. And I think if you factor in New Orleans, I could see the argument for either one, right? Because I still think that the Saints improved their team with their coaching staff changes. I just don't know that they necessarily improved their roster. So we'll see how it all goes. Tomorrow, later on today, schedule will release. It'll be out before the NFL tells you what it is, but it will be officially released, and therefore tomorrow, probably later on tonight, we'll have some shows for you to take a look at the toughest stretches, a little bit of win-loss prediction. I don't care. I'll do it. I'll do a win-loss prediction as early as I want. I'll do it whenever I want. But I got to see how it works out. Got to see where the bye week is. Like, those are the other ones too. But otherwise, those are our three biggest questions for the New Orleans Saints schedule. And then we'll see where all the rest of it falls. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. Every day, Locked On Pels, Locked On LSU. That should be your second listen today as you continue on checking in with Locked On Louisiana. Appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know what family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.